Hi, this is Dr. Mike Yuan. Today I'd like to talk about Grandmaster Yang Sau Chung's extraordinary quality of awareness and capability. And I emphasize the word quality because I've already, in the previous videos, talked a lot about the quantitative or the visible aspect of his remarkable skill. But in describing his quality, I'm having to go a little bit more into myself and recounting the experience I had with him, but on another level of observation. So I've become aware as I've been making these videos that what I'm doing is creating a sort of tribute to Grandmaster Yang Sau Chung with the intention of establishing him as the fourth generation patriarch of the Yang family tradition. Again, this is amidst the 250 million practitioners of Tai Chi Chuan in the world. This man's history needs to be known and appreciated to its fullest extent. So today I'm going to draw from my experiences in 1981, 1983, and 1985. They sort of come together to paint a complete picture of Grandmaster Yang as I knew him. A collection of experiences that portray this quality of extraordinary awareness and capability. You might recall in episode 2 my excitement when he opened the door to their apartment and the immediate impression I got upon, for the first time, being in his presence. The immediate impression was that of kindness. And I'm not joking here. There are a lot of good people in the world, but there was even an extraordinary quality to his kindness and his gentility. Hardly the formidable young Tai Chi fighter that fills the books and legends that's made Yang Tai Chi Chuan famous through the world, starting with his great-grandfather, Yang2 Cheng2 who had the reputation of being Yang Wu Di, young with no enemies. So I guess that on first blush we might assume that to have no enemies means that all enemies were defeated. But I'd like us to consider another angle to that story. Certainly there was the skill. But in order for us modern folks to optimally benefit from Yang Tai Chi practice, we need to know this other side, the qualitative side. And so there was that kindness that I felt, an immediate welcome, and not even that, but a type of curiosity that one would not expect someone of such authority to carry. It was natural, but there was no pretense about him as a person. He was what the Chinese call 平常心里, or 平常心, which means ordinary in his disposition, not holding himself to anything. Yet that's probably what's behind what made him so extraordinary. And I've seen this in other masters as well, or highly accomplished people in both East and West. I've had the privilege to be around Western scientists and scholars, and the more accomplished they are, it seems that the more ordinary they are in their manner and disposition. But Grandmaster Yang's was that, but then add to that the extraordinary quality that comes from training your body in martial arts. And that was him. I'd mentioned about what happened when he first turned and spoke to me at the table in stopping my thoughts. But maybe even more disarming than that was his posture, this gentle sloping of his back and shoulders, very graceful and very beautiful, that was matched by his voice, which bore two qualities that I'll forever remember as characteristic of the Chinese gentleman. One is that his voice was flute-like. There was a timbre and a transcendent quality to his voice, and there was a cadence to his voice that spoke of an inner rhythm. And combine that together with his look that I mentioned. Chinese tradition speaks of beauty in a man's eyes as Longyan, dragon eyes. If not beauty, it would be profundity. And to match that, there would be the Fengyan, the phoenix eyes, that would denote beauty in a woman. Grandmaster Yang's eyes had that look of a dragon, and that together with the fierce focus of a wildcat, of a tiger or a lion or leopard or jaguar, just looking at you. I hope I'm able to convey that this all came out of effortlessness. It came out of his age, his experience. What I saw in his eyes was all that history that people of his generation went through in China, yet held all in the present to a point. And so his command was that of, in Tai Chi Chuan they talk about ji, they talk about condensing or congealing the spirit and the chi. That may be the best way for me to describe the impression of this, but together with the flute-like voice and the beauty that he exuded, it really was not that of the ruffian, of the fighter, of the bedraggled, I'm not sure if this is the right word, war-torn warrior, but more of a refined gentleman. There was a welcoming spirit, and the kindness and the curiosity he had was, as I said, quite unlike what I expected. So translate that to the corrections. There was, again, in his voice, there was an inner timing or inner rhythm, and the sheer joy that he had of being in himself. In the corrections, he would say, he'd mix his Mandarin with some Cantonese. He'd say, then you do this, and then this, and then this, and then dak. Well, that means, 得了, you've done it. You achieved it. Stop right there. Capture that moment. This is how he was using his words to direct my attention to what was important and not important. And for maybe where this quality of voice came from that was so connected and integrated with his movement, perhaps, and this is as much as I'm able to claim I know, but perhaps it came from the command of the forces that the Yang style cultivates. because not only in the corrections was the use of his words, his tonality at the forefront of my impression, but it was when he used it in the pushing hands and application that basically the martial application of Yang Tai Chi Chuan was one and the same as the use of sound effects. Everything he did practically had sounds attached to it, and not used in the ki sense of using it to pierce the attention of the opponent. It definitely had that effect, but it was more coming from the inside and an expression of his awareness of what was happening inside himself as he was manipulating the forces. The one word I can use to describe when he really applied that in the application was the voice sounded ghoulish. And back then, 36 years ago, the distinct impression I got was that he was tapping some other invisible, maybe otherworldly force, and that might explain what Yang Luchan had discovered. And perhaps, and I'm using my imagination here, perhaps that was a key aspect of the Yang family practice that was passed down through the generations. Because when you think about it, what are the chances that Yang Sau Chung acquired this quality of usage of sound and voice on his own, that the previous generations, including Yang Cheng2 were silent, and that this was only his original idiosyncrasy, so to speak. Just given how masterful the voice was used in coordination with the different types of forces that he commanded. Let's just divide it conveniently into forces that came from physical contact, forces that came from social contact, like talking, and then forces that came that had the result of influencing me, pulling energy out of me with a gesture like this, an inch from my body, and then completely whoop, lifting my energy out of me. That, I remember the daughters all gasping, oh, when he did it. And there was no contact, but it just opened and pulled my breath out physically. So it was more than just a psychic. There was a physical component to the influence. I'd been doing the iron palm, the version that Jin Sun had taught, and using oil-covered shot put to strengthen my grip. So I was doing that very, very heavily at the age of 24. And as part of our conversation, he had noticed that my palms were slightly red. And again, the use of his voice, he said, 你的手怎么那么红? Why are your hands so red? It was more that I was taken back by the quality of his presence, of his focus, of his really caring, really focusing in on me, a nobody, but in the way a good doctor would, who wouldn't be differentiating between who the patient was. A patient is simply a patient. But this is the type of presence and attention that I felt from him. Now back to the ghoulish sound. The closest to this expression I can think of that would be something that we could all have access to would be Bruce Lee in a couple of his movies when he would bring out that ghoulish sound. One was, I think, when he had a staff in his hands. but there was that sense of accessing this very deep, terrifying, yet humanly aware aspect. That would be close to what I think you can relate to. And that translated over to 1983, 2 years later, when I went back to Hong Kong with Jin-Sun Chu and a few of my classmates to pay a visit to Grandmaster Yang. And we watched Grandmaster Yang pushing hands with Jin-Sun. And for those who are listening now, who were there with me, you may recall Yang Sau Chung's use of sound effects in his application. But I also want to tie it together with the fact that as he was giving corrections, there was also a very similar expression. In other words, it wasn't as if he turned on and off this quality. This was just a part of him as a person. As I was leaving the first time, Grandmaster Yang held his hands in the Jianzhuang posture and said, 你把我教你的东西含在心里，让它养活. Something to that effect. He said, take what I've just taught you and hold it in your heart in this way. Hold it in your heart and let it grow. So there was a spirit to that I took and applied religiously, which I think attributed to the rapid growth of power that I described. Now, the role I had gotten myself into in this first trip, in being a nobody, not being accomplished yet in the company of greatness, continued in the second trip as Master Chu and the rest of the students were returning to the US. The idea was raised that I go on a side trip to China with one of my classmates to sightsee, but as part of that, to go visit Yang Sau Chung's younger brother, Yang Zhen2, who was in Taiyuan in Shanxi province. Yang Sau Chung was in agreement to that. Or maybe it was Yang Sau Chung's idea. You know what? I don't really remember where this plan started. But Grandmaster Yang wrote a letter, handwritten letter, that I was to present when I got to China. And they would give us permission to travel to Shanxi, so to the Midwest from Beijing, and to meet with Yang Zhen2. So another vivid memories, as the others were leaving, Grandmaster Yang pulled me aside and presented me with the letter, and was very deliberate in his instruction. The first was, please send my brother my warmest greetings. The second thing he said was, if he asks how I'm doing, just say Mama Hoo Hoo, that I'm Mama Hoo Hoo. Now, Mama Hoo Hoo means horse, horse, tiger, tiger. It means ordinary, nothing special. And so again, here I am being commissioned to convey this message to another renowned Yang Tai Chi proponent in the world, in Yang Zhen2. But then the third thing he said really put me on guard. He said, 你不要让他碰你. You don't want to let him touch you. And so suddenly it turned from a social exchange to that of power. So I had no choice but to say okay. And my classmate and I went to China, enjoyed some traveling, But that meeting with Yang Zhendor, which I had promised you I would share, was a repeat in terms of my playing this role as an intermediary and not knowing what I was getting myself into. Again, these impressions all contribute to the 36-year hiatus I took from Yang Tai Chi. What do I do with this information? So now it's only because of this training that I've put together and this wonderful response and interest that's coming through. It's almost as if I needed to justify sharing these confidential, very private experiences. But I need to do it in order to clear the board. I need to do it in order to set things straight so that there's transparency. And that would then set the best conditions for imparting what I know moving forward. So there was a lot of nervousness and excitement again as we arrived in Taiyuan and stayed the night at a hotel. And the next morning we were picked up by a car and brought to a hotel and led up to a second floor conference room. A lot of tables and chairs. Sat nervously, not knowing what to expect. Treated very diplomatically by the hosts. So we're sitting there and the door opens and Yang Zhendor steps in. Now, if there wasn't a more spitting image of Yang Cheng Fu, it would be Yang Zhendor. He might have been a bit shorter, but he had that same look in his face and his very broad physical stature. Very friendly man. And behind him filed in about 10 people. And they didn't look countryish at all. In fact, they looked like Secret Service, which only served to put me more on guard as to what I was getting into here. So sitting across from each other, we exchanged niceties. My ability to speak Mandarin was paramount here. And I conveyed to Master Yang Zhendor his brother's greetings. And he did ask how he was doing. I did say Mama Hoo Hoo, which I think put Yang Zhendor more on alert. So am I dealing with sorcery here or what? I mean, what was Yang Sau Chung's intention to say that? Because it's clear that what does Mama Hoo Hoo mean anyway in terms of a Yang Tai Chi family? So it may have put Yang Zhendor on alert in that I was conveying from his elder brother that things were pretty plain over there in Hong Kong. And so after a while, he stood up and commanded me to stand up. So what could I do? I had a premonition this was going to happen, but it actually was happening. And in front of all these people, he instructed me to get into the ward-off position. And again, because I was young and training hours a day and power pushing, my normal stance doing the form was very low. I saw his eyes were surprised that I was staying so low and standing there with my ward-off position. So as I was posed there in the ward-off, he went into instructional mode, explaining to the people what this was and how it was part of tradition. and suddenly caught me by surprise by taking his left arm and placing it on top of my arm, pushing me down. He did it so quickly that it caught me off guard. And what it did was bring my instinctive reaction out, which was, as we had trained, to just resist. And that's what I did, and that's what happened. At that instant, what went through both of our minds, I'm sure, was the truth. I didn't budge. I knew his level, and he knew that I knew his level, which caused him to react in a certain dramatic way. So that was the essence. At that moment of contact, because he'd caught me by surprise, and I came out with what my body knew, I knew, and he knew I knew, where things stood between he and his elder brother in Hong Kong. And that basically sums up the whole trip for me. It was great seeing the Great Wall and the Ming tombs and so forth, but again, here I was, this young person trying to digest what I had just gone through. So my relationship with the Yang family did not end in 1983, but continued to 1985, where I'd struck up a long-distance correspondence with the daughter Mary and ended up making plans to spend the summer in Hong Kong to explore the possibilities. Well, as much as Grandmaster Yang was excited about his daughter opening a school in America, he even wrote down on a piece of paper the name of the school in Chinese. I very much enjoyed the conversations where he was full bore in sharing facets of the system with me. When I first arrived, things looked rosy. We first met in a big restaurant for lunch. And after the tea came in the porcelain pot, Grandmaster Yang turned over the teacups and began pouring the tea. He did it so fast, he filled each cup to the brim with utmost abandon, not spilling one drop. And then, after the meal, he took a toothpick from the toothpick dispenser, removed the wrapper, put the toothpick in his mouth, rolled up the wrapper into a ball, and unceremoniously flicked it across the table, landing in an empty ashtray. Now, these are things that this man would do apparently on an ordinary basis. I feel it's important to share these details because they're such rare observations, but also in terms of your training and what you want to get from your Tai Chi practice, this represents the upper end of just a supreme quality of awareness that actually translates to capability and his gestures with the world. Well, unfortunately, the relationship didn't turn out. It was sort of doomed from the start because as everyone went ahead into the flat, Grandmaster's wife stopped me in the dark stairwell and told me that I should go back home. Told me I should 回去美国, go back to America, and said In other words, that left no question in one's mind that I was not welcomed there in the family. The tension, the anxiety that imposed on the relationship was something that I wasn't able to manage. Quite immediately, I knocked over the hot water thermos in the apartment. And whereas Grandmaster Yang was so excited in promoting his school, who could blame his wife at around age 70 for not wanting her daughter to leave for another country? You see it all the time in psychology. It's very understandable. But the effect it had on me, that apparently has lasted for decades before I could sort it out, was, again, how do I get myself into these situations where it's never all systems go? So the influence of Yang Sau Chung's wife on me was everything. I come from a family of very strong women. My grandmother on my dad's side was the American Mother of the Year in 1952, given an honorary American citizenship from Bess Truman. And my mom, bless her soul, who's just about to turn 98, is the matriarch and the godmother of Boston Chinatown, still doing her activist work. So I was raised to really heed what women say. And in this case, it really put a dagger in my relationship with the Yangs. Ended up leaving very confused and quite apologetically. And again, what struck me most was the last exchange I had with Grandmaster Yang, where he was so kind and understanding. And he said, "没有关系, it's okay. If you change your mind, just give us a call." And that's where he left it, and really demonstrated to me the transcendence that he possessed in his embodiment. But you may also understand, in terms of my mission for the Advanced Yang Taiji Corrections training, to be an interface to elevate the level and standard of Yang family Taiji Chuan practice in the world. But in order to do this, it's going to require that we restore fourth generation patriarch Yang Sau Chung as the head of the system, which is unrecognized now even in China. And the continuation of that would be to recognize Mary Yang, who learned the most from her father, as a Chinese national treasure. Whether these efforts on my part will ever take hold, no one knows. But I could at least say that my conscience is clear, in that I know I had karma with that family. And I'd greatly be remiss at the end of my life if I didn't at least try to recruit all my knowledge experience, which includes the other Chinese research I've done, which you'll hear about more in Advanced Human Training, to help restore the original standard, and in concrete terms to support Mary Yang in whatever initiative she chooses to take regarding her role in the world. So this was definitely a trying sharing, needing to process some quite painful experiences, but I hope you can now understand me better and the Yang family better, their situation that is, and to understand that we're supporting the entirety of the Yang Tai Chi cause in the world. Okay, thank you for listening this morning. Dr. Mike, signing off.